It's awful hard to feed livestock and do it well if we don't know what we're feeding them.
Hello folks, Brady Campbell here. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Sciences where I serve as the State Small Ruminant Extension Specialist.
I'm Garth, Ruff, Beef Cattle Field Specialist with OSU Extension.
Today we're here to discuss the importance of forage testing and how to read an analysis.
Part of the reason behind what we're doing here, we had a very wet spring. A lot of our forages were made late here in 2025. And we thought it was important to get out, get samples from across the state and really monitor what's going on in terms of forage quality. We collected 180 hay samples from across the state, 29 counties. When we look at those samples from a total digestible nutrient standpoint, right, how much energy is in that forage, being that most of our first cutting hay was made so late, the TDN levels in that forage were pretty poor across the board. Whether that was first cutting, second cutting, haylage. Going into this winter, we need to look at supplementation and maybe some different ways to feed cows and get them through the winter and get them through spring calving season.
On the small ruminant side, sheep and goats, it's going to be a struggle for us if we continue feeding some of these poor quality forages. We're not as flexible as cattle in that standpoint because we just have such a smaller animal that we're dealing with, about 1/10 of the size. So if this forages that we're feeding aren't of quality to be feeding our beef cattle, they certainly aren't of quality to be feeding our small ruminants as well. There are a variety of labs that you can submit your samples to. Each of those labs will have their individual way of submitting results to you as the producer and the consumer of this information, but there's going to be a standardized parameters that will be available, and those would be some of the things that we'll discuss. I think the very first one that we can talk about that's going to be at the very top of your list, regardless of who is analyzing it, is going to be dry matter. And that describes the amount of moisture that's in the sample. Whether you're taking a sample of haylage, baleage, silage, or dry made hay, there's still going to be an amount of moisture that's available in that sample.
If we're below 20%, we typically consider that dry hay. 50% to 65%, that's our haylage, our baleage, our silage type feeds. And if we're somewhere in the middle, we're kind of in no man's land. It's very hard to make good quality feed, get feed to ferment if we're between that 25 to 45, 50% dry matter.
One, we want to understand that forage was made correctly, especially for fermentation purposes on our unsiled feeds. But number two, we want to ensure that there isn't any mold from that standpoint on the dry feeds. But when we're balancing rations for livestock species, we always balance it on a dry matter basis. So that's why it's going to be critical that we have it within our specific thresholds.
The next thing that we'll often see is a crude protein. Need a minimum 7% to keep the microbes in the rumen happy.
And in some of these samples, Garth, we saw that some were well below that threshold as well.
And if we're below that, then we got to look at supplementation, in the form of some grain-based protein going forward.
But I think on the bright side too, if we understand that our feedstuffs are high in crude protein, that means we can maybe save some money on the back end as it relates to some of our supplemental feeds as well. Because at the end of the day, crude protein is going to be our most expensive portion of our livestock diet.
I would say on most analysis, the next couple things we're going to see is acid detergent fiber, the percent of that, ADF, or percent NDF. We spend a lot more time focusing on NDF. The higher percent NDF we have is going to relate to two things. It's going to tell us how much that animal can physically eat, right? A bulkier, stemmier forage is going to have a higher percent of neutral detergent fiber versus something that's highly digestible having a lower percent. So if we're going to look at the two and make decisions, really want to focus on NDF. Legumes, 40, 50%. NDF is acceptable. We get into good grass hay, 50 to 60. When we get much above 60, we're running into forages that are less digestible. Nutrients are just not as concentrated in those forage samples.
A lower percentage on that NDF, less density, the more feed that we can get into some of our livestock species, and that is beneficial. Too little is also a challenge as well. This time of year, we may be out grazing some annual forages, some cover crops in some of these systems. High moisture, low fiber. At that rate, animals have a high throughput, if you would. Digestibility decreases. So too much is not a good thing, and too little can also be detrimental. So we want to find that Goldilocks situation where it's just the right amount of fiber in our diet.
Kind of the next thing that shows up on that forage analysis, you're going to have some minerals. We can look at those, but we really need to consider a complete mineral program regardless of what ruminant species we're feeding. That's going to vary from one species to the next, but a good free choice mineral program is important regardless of what that forage analysis says.
As we continue to work down through the list, a couple others that come to mind. One's going to be ash. That is a good indicator of the inorganic material that might be in your sample. That helps us understand how that hay was harvested and processed at the end of the day. If we have a higher percentage of ash, something north of 10%, that tells us that more than likely there's a lot of dirt, dust, and other foreign material that might be in there. That might be a situation where the producer or farmer needs to go back, readjust the cutting height of their mower, adjust the tines on their tedders and their rakes to reduce the amount of dirt into that sample.
So think about what we're growing, soil type, equipment. Ash is a big one, one we often don't put enough consideration into.
Another one that I like to take a look at is going to be lignin. Lignin is going to be our indigestible proportion of that diet, commonly represented or included in that ADF percentage, but we want to ensure that we remain quite low in our sample with those lignin values.
And probably the last thing we see on a forage analysis is a combination of two numbers depending on the lab you use, either RFV, relative forage value, or RFQ, relative forage quality. RFV is really intended for alfalfa type samples, discriminates hard against mature grass samples versus RFQs more grass friendly. These values are often used to determine hay price in a dairy or high-end equine setting. NAP insurance, one of the more common insurance products out there for forages, uses RFV. So if you're in that program, having RFV on an analysis is something you'll need to turn in to the Farm Service Agency.
And I think the last one that I like to take a look at is going to be TDN, which represents our total digestible nutrients. And so at the very minimum or the basic level, as you take a look at that percentage, that's going to describe the amount or the percentage of that forage that's going to be available for digestibility.
When that TDN level is low, to sustain a 1,200 pound beef cow in just gestation, we need a TDN level around 54%. That lactating 1,200 pound beef cow requires a TDN of around 60%. Only one of 180 samples that we took from across the state would maintain that lactating 1,200 pound beef cow.
If you've got 100 pounds of forage laying there, 60% or 60 pounds of that sample will be digested or have the ability to be digested by that animal. So therefore, if we're taking a look at that TDN value, a greater value or a greater percentage is what we're aiming for.
But that's where you got to start, right? We don't know what we don't know. It's awful hard to feed livestock and do it well if we don't know what we're feeding them.